"The king is dead!" But the ship kept sailing. On April 8, 1605, the Royal Alcazar of Valladolid, Spain, welcomed a future monarch, Philip IV of Austria. A monarch destined to be crushed by the weight of his own bloodline. But how could a royal birth be a tragedy? The answer lies generations earlier, with the dynasty weaving a genetic trap. Philip was the son of Philip III and Margarita of Austria, cousins. This was no accident. For centuries, the Habsburgs had practiced consanguineous marriages to keep power within the family, a tradition that would ultimately be their undoing. The blood of the Austrias must remain pure, the royal advisors said. But this purity hid the seeds of destruction. To the court, young Philip represented a promising future for the Spanish Empire. But those who looked close could see that the boy carried the accumulated genetic baggage of generations of inbreeding. Flash forward 16 years. Philip IV ascends to the throne in 1621, a seemingly healthy young man of 16. But portraits already hint at what's to come. An elongated face, a prominent jaw, a paleness that deepens with time. The young monarch confided to his confessor. Spain, still a world power, showed signs of political and economic decline, but the king's body held a parallel decay, a genetic deterioration that would manifest brutally. Some courtiers whispered that the young king seemed to age prematurely, his features growing strangely accentuated, exhausted for no apparent reason. The ambassadors saw it too. "The king carries in his face the history of his house," wrote the Venetian ambassador. But it wasn't just his looks. By 1623, Diego Velázquez became the court painter, the visual chronicler of this physical decline. Velázquez's portraits, spanning decades, are a chilling testament to the king's deteriorating body. The early portraits show a distinguished young monarch with typical Habsburg features within normal parameters. But with each new portrait, the king's features become more extreme, more deformed. "His Majesty wishes me to paint him as he is, not as he would like to be," Velázquez remarked. "I fulfill my duty, though my hand sometimes trembles at what my eyes see." The mandibular prognathism worsened year after year, his lower lip protruding more, hindering speech and eating. His eyes, sunken deeper, acquired a melancholic gaze. His nose, long and aquiline, seemed disproportionate, but what they didn't know was that his face was only the beginning. Philip IV began experiencing joint pain unusually early. His weak, inflamed legs caused constant pain he tried to hide during public ceremonies. The court physicians, baffled, prescribed bloodletting and purgatives, further weakening him. Wrote the royal physician Juan Gutierrez de Solórzano in a confidential report. As his body deteriorated, Philip IV desperately tried to control a collapsing empire. Spain faced rebellions in Catalonia and Portugal, military defeats in Europe, and an economic crisis. The connection between the king's physical decline and the Spanish Empire's decay was clear. By 1640, at 39, Philip IV showed premature aging that shocked foreign ambassadors. His dark hair had turned completely gray. His energy waned, spending hours in solitary meditation, tormented by physical pain and the decline of his kingdom. But then, tragedy struck. The death of his son Baltasar Carlos, his most promising heir, plunged the king into a deep depression, worsening his physical problems. His second wife, Mariana of Austria, also his niece, bore him several children, but most died in infancy, victims of the genetic fragility caused by inbreeding. The king confessed after another child's death. The king's body became a living metaphor for a declining empire. Both monarch and empire seemed to collapse under decisions made generations ago. Public ceremonies became an ordeal for Philip IV, enduring long periods standing while his body protested with acute pain. Official meals became torment, his deformed jaw making it difficult to chew. In 1660, during negotiations for the Peace of the Pyrenees, French diplomats were shocked by the Spanish king's appearance. "His Catholic Majesty looks like a 70-year-old man, though he is barely over 50, wrote the French envoy. "His lower jaw is so prominent that his teeth cannot meet, causing him great difficulty speaking." The Count Duke of Olivares, the king's right-hand man for decades, observed in his final years, "As the 1660s progressed, Philip IV became increasingly aware that he represented the end of his dynasty. His only surviving son, the future Charles II, born of his union with his niece Mariana, showed even more severe signs of genetic degeneration from the cradle. The boy was weak, sickly, and had more pronounced facial deformities than his father. The king lamented seeing his heir's difficulties. "The blood of the Austrias has turned against us." In these final years, Philip IV alternated between intense religious activity and deep melancholy. His body, increasingly fragile, seemed to be consuming itself from within. The joint pain became constant, and he developed chronic digestive problems that doctors couldn't relieve. The face Velázquez immortalized in multiple portraits sank further, becoming a mask of suffering that the king tried to hide behind courtly protocol. His jaw, so exaggeratedly prominent, had become a symbol of his dynasty, now causing him breathing problems during sleep. Reported a chamberlain, "The physical deformities of Philip IV, the result of generations of inbreeding, affected not only his appearance, but also his health and quality of life." What had begun as a distinctive Habsburg trait, that pronounced chin considered a sign of nobility, had become a monstrous deformity threatening the monarch's life. Meanwhile, the Spanish Empire continued its decline. Territories under Spanish control for generations were lost. The economy, burdened by constant wars and inefficient administration, sank into one crisis after another. The parallel between the king's physical collapse and the imperial decline was too evident to ignore. 16 wrote an anonymous chronicler, "The final years of Philip IV were a painful testament to how dynastic inbreeding could destroy not only a man, but an entire royal lineage. The monarch's body, once that of a hunting king and art lover, had become a prison of pain and deformity." In 1665, at 60, Philip IV looked like a decrepit old man. His jaw, grotesquely prominent, made his face seem a caricature of himself. His legs, weakened by joint and circulatory problems, could barely support him during official ceremonies. Often, courtiers had to come to his aid when the pain became unbearable, though protocol demanded pretending nothing abnormal was happening. The respiratory problems worsened to the point that Philip IV developed sleep apnea, a condition aggravated by his deformed jaw. His nights became a torture of sudden awakenings and choking sensations. The royal physicians, baffled by symptoms they didn't understand, resorted to useless remedies that only increased the monarch's suffering. The mandibular deformation not only affected his breathing, but also his ability to feed himself adequately. The misalignment between his upper and lower jaws was so severe that his teeth didn't fit correctly, making chewing difficult. As a result, Philip IV progressively lost weight, and his immune system, already compromised by consanguinity, weakened further. To these physical problems were added concerns about the dynasty's future. His heir, Prince Charles, showed signs of genetic degeneration even more severe than his own. At 4 years old, the boy could barely walk, and his mental development seemed stunted. His jaw was so prominent that he couldn't close his mouth completely and suffered frequent respiratory infections. The Countess of Paredes sadly observed of the little one. But no one could predict what would happen next. The king was dying, but it wasn't just an illness. It was generations of royal decisions collapsing in on him. Decisions about blood, about power, about who his family would marry. And as he lay there, Philip IV knew his son, his heir, would suffer even more. But to understand the weight of that despair, we need to go back to the choices that sealed their fate, choices made not out of love, but out of a cold, calculated desire to keep their empire whole. God has punished me, he confessed, in my own flesh and in the flesh of my son. Was this, he wondered, the end of their line? Philip IV retreated inward, his mind sharp even as his body failed. He saw, with agonizing clarity, how the Habsburgs' obsession with marrying within the family had poisoned their bloodline. He wrote to his sister, "What they thought was prudence, marrying cousins to keep the kingdoms united, had become their doom." His daily pains, he said, were the price for that ancient vanity, and he feared Carlos would pay an even greater price. But what did this actually look like? Spring of 1665, Philip's health spiraled. On top of everything else, dysentery ravaged his already weakened body. Decades of genetic damage had left him with no reserves. Doctors watched, helpless, as the king wasted away. His face, marked by that infamous Habsburg jaw, became skeletal. The papal nuncio wrote to Rome, "His Majesty seems more of the other world than this. His body, deformed by the evils of his blood, barely holds a breath of life." Then, September 17th, 1665, after days of agony, Philip IV breathed his last in the palace. His death was the culmination of generations of inbreeding, a body turned against itself. The autopsy revealed a horror show of pathologies, deformed organs, fragile bones, signs of autoimmune disorders. His Majesty's body showed the ravages not just of his final illness, but of ancient evils that seemed to have been born with him, the royal physician recorded. A small, weak heart, a damaged liver, bones that broke with unnatural ease. But Philip's death wasn't the end. It was merely a transition to an even more tragic chapter. The throne now belonged to his 4-year-old son, Carlos. But Carlos was even worse. He was the walking embodiment of the Habsburgs' genetic decay. The boy who would be known as Carlos II suffered extreme physical deformities, developmental delays, and a constitution so fragile few believed he'd reach adulthood. "The boy king carries the death sentence of our dynasty in his body," one courtier whispered. "In him, the blood of the Habsburgs has reached its limit." And that limit was infertility. Despite 2 marriages, Carlos II produced no heir. So, in 1700, at the age of 38, after a reign of sickness and suffering, Carlos II died. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty died with him. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, forever changing the map of Europe. But the story doesn't end with Carlos's death. The genetic legacy of Philip IV and his son became a chilling lesson for future generations. Centuries later, as genetics advanced, the Habsburgs became a textbook example of the dangers of inbreeding. How did they know? Studies in the 21st century, analyzing portraits of the dynasty, scientifically confirmed what Philip IV's contemporaries had only suspected. The Habsburg jaw, the facial deformities, intensified with each generation. In 2019, geneticists at the University of Santiago de Compostela analyzed the Habsburg family tree. They concluded that Philip IV had a consanguinity coefficient of 0.154, meaning roughly a quarter of his genes were identical due to inbreeding. Carlos II's coefficient was even higher, 0.254, almost the level of a child born from siblings. The study concluded that Philip IV, and especially Carlos II, represented one of history's clearest examples of how inbreeding can lead to a lineage's biological extinction. What began as a distinctive facial feature, the Habsburg jaw, became a crippling deformity that contributed to the physical collapse of the last monarchs. The body that collapsed on the throne was not just a man, but an entire dynasty that had ignored the basic laws of biology for far too long. Philip IV's reign coincided with the political decline of the Spanish Empire. In his failing body, he embodied the genetic decline of one of Europe's most powerful royal houses. The tragic story of Philip IV and Carlos II serves as a dark reminder. Even the mightiest dynasties are subject to the unforgiving laws of nature. The king's body, deformed by centuries of inbreeding, became the physical symbol of an empire that, like its monarch, collapsed under the weight of decisions made generations ago.